Witnesses for both sides played crucial roles during the tribunal. As one of the most brutal atrocities committed in World War II, the Nanjing Massacre was a particular focus. The prosecution and the defense both provided witnesses in this case. Witnesses of the Nanjing Massacre included Iwani Matsue, the commander of the Japanese expeditionary force sent to China, and Sekijiro Ogawa, the Minister of Justice of the Japanese 10th Army. In his sworn affidavit, Iwani Matsue claimed that he dedicated himself to Sino-Japanese rapprochement during his 12-year stay in China, and that he had demanded discipline in the army. His statement was supported by evidence provided by the defense. Sekijiro Ogawa testified, Commander Iwani Matsue demanded all the soldiers to observe discipline to protect the interests of Chinese citizens and other foreigners. Cheng Jiaoqi, the director of the Center for the Tokyo Trials Studies at Shanghai Jiaotong University, investigated first-hand evidence, including the diaries of the defendants and witnesses published since the 1980s, and found that their testimonies were inconsistent with the evidence.
小川官治郎呢，他在宣誓口供书里面说，他说他见到松井石根是在1938年的1月4号，松井石根就跟他讲，你一定要这个加强军风纪。但是我们现在翻开小川官治郎的日记里面呢，1月4号他根本就没有离开第10军的军部，而见到松井石根呢，他是在1月15号。而1月15号见到松井石根那天他是有详细记录的，根本就没有讲到军风纪。
Iwani Matsue was in favor of Asianism, and he had a strong interest in Chinese civilization. He was a famous China expert in Japan, who excelled in the Chinese language, could recite ancient Chinese poems, and was proficient at calligraphy. He also understood China's society, system, geography, and history.
If you examine the instrument which has been handed you, Defense Document 2738, tell this tribunal whether that is your affidavit? I was always firm in the belief that the strife between Japan and China was a quarrel between brothers in the so-called household of Asia. Therefore, when I assumed the command of the expeditionary force, I promised myself to settle the trouble between Japan and China on this belief, and hoped to make the dispatch of the expeditionary force not a cause for mutual enmity, but something that would help to bring about friendly relations and cooperation between the two nations.
During the tribunal, he claimed he was a Sinophile sent to China to end the war. The order to attack China made him very distressed. However, his diary proved otherwise.
当时给他的任务是保护上海居留民和上海周边的交通要道，但是呢，他打下上海以后呢，不断的向西北往南京方面进发，参谋本部不断给他下命令，几次说打到这里你不能再前进了。他在他的日记里边，甚至他这样写下对中央政府的这种愚昧，他是用的汉字鞭笞2个字，他说应该鞭笞对他们。所以说呢，战争打到不可收拾，打下中国首都，这个跟松井石根的个人责任是最大的。
To state, according to your conscience and truth, not to conceal anything from nor to add anything whatever to the truth. Yes.
Will you give your name and address to the tribunal, please?
Iwani Matsue's secretary, Takashi Okada, testified that on December 18, 1937, the day after the Japanese army entered Nanjing, Matsue said in pain, "My wish for the last 30 years was peace between China and Japan, and that the war between the two countries was a tragedy, and he was truly sorry." When he returned to Shanghai on December 21st, he wrote in his diary, "It has only been 2 weeks since I left Shanghai, and I have accomplished the great undertaking of occupying Nanjing. It is a pleasure to be back." The content of his diary refuted Okada's testimony. During the invasion, the Japanese army did not permit news of the massacre to become public knowledge. Therefore, the Nanjing Massacre was not widely known to the world. In order to find more witnesses and evidence, prosecutor Xiang Chechun sent several telegrams to the Chinese government to explain the importance of evidence.
他们去的第一件事情，我们现在也看到发回来的很多电报，都是希望国内尽快的提供日本这个军人在中国各地方的暴行、各地方的罪证。
According to the tribunal's transcripts, 11 witnesses appeared in court during the portion about the Nanjing Massacre, 8 of whom came from China. Arnold Brackman of the United Press Associations recorded a number of speeches made by Chinese witnesses in his book. He wrote, "The dimensions of the rape of Nanking were so vast that 2 witnesses, independently of each other, said from the stand in an awed tone of bewilderment, 'I don't know where to begin.'" He also recorded the testimony of minor Searle Bates on December 15th. Bates had degrees from the University of Oxford, Yale University, and Harvard University, and was a teacher at the University of Nanking. On December 15th, Bates testified, 30 college girls were raped on his campus in one building alone. 3 days later, 18 girls were raped in 6 different locations on campus. A suppressed gasp went up among spectators and others when Bates offhandedly remarked that his university was located next to the Japanese embassy.
Mr. Bates, not having seen the messages, I assume you do not know of your own knowledge to whom they were sent in Tokyo. Is that right?
Some Japanese sources on that.
Your Honor, please, I ask this...
When the prosecution asked him who had been in command of the Japanese troops at Nanking, Bates replied, "The defendant, General Iwani Matsue." Arnold Brackman wrote, "And all eyes in the courtroom involuntarily turned to the dock, where the aged and gaunt Matsue looked as if he wanted to flee." There were a large number of spectators during the Nanjing Massacre portion of the trials. Many Japanese citizens waited in line outside, hoping to get a seat inside the court. There were sections reserved for journalists and the public. Families of members of each delegation were also allowed to attend the trials. At first, many Japanese people came to the court and were skeptical. Japanese people were shocked as the trials unfolded.
Because Japanese government used every kind of means to tell the people in Tokyo, in Japan, that Japanese soldiers were very good soldiers, and very behavioral and very brave. And when the rape of Nanking was brought to trial, they were quite astonished. They never knew that the Japanese, their soldiers had done such atrocities in Nanking.
Asahi Shimbun journalists sifted through the materials and published the transcripts of the proceedings of the IMTFE. Chief Prosecutor Keenan's speech was published. It read in part, "The defendants treated human beings as mortgage by conquering, enslaving, and killing millions of people, which was like a game to them. Conventions and treaties are merely words and papers in their eyes." In the court's verdict, there was a section called Nanjing Massacre under the 8th chapter. In this section, the Japanese army's atrocities were recorded in detail, including murder, rape, and looting. Arnold Brackman wrote in his book, "The rape of Nanking was not the kind of isolated incident common to all wars. It was deliberate. It was policy." However, even to this day, China and Japan haven't reached a consensus on the number of casualties in the Nanking Massacre.
But I think the continuing debate over the numbers of individuals killed at Nanjing is really very misleading. It doesn't matter whether there were 100,000, 200,000, or 300,000. That's mass atrocity. It's mass murder. The other reason is because it creates the impression that it was only at Nanjing that these things happened.
Professor Young found an important diary in the National Archives of the United States. He had been appointed a historical consultant to the Nazi War Crimes and Japanese Imperial Government's Records Interagency Working Group at the U.S. National Archives. It belonged to a Japanese army doctor, Akira Hosaka. He recorded the details of a group of Japanese soldiers killing Chinese civilians in Changzhou on their way to Nanjing.
I assume that he always felt this conflict in his moral conscience. And after Japan's defeat, he submitted this diary to the American authorities with the hope that American occupation authorities will investigate this particular war crime. Unfortunately, this was not the case, I think, because this particular massacre took place not in Nanjing, but in Changzhou. And therefore, it was not considered part of the investigation conducted by the Tokyo War Crimes Trial that focused on Nanjing.
Former Japanese Prime Minister Yukio Hatayama had visited the Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall and planted a peace tree in the Peace Park.
極めて多くの命が、特に一般の市民の命が奪われたということは事実です。しかも当時のメディア、朝日新聞などがですね、むしろ100人斬り、むしろそれを賛美しているような、そういう記事を書いているわけです。決してこれはなかったのだととても言える話ではない。ニュースだと思ったら、ぜひ南京虐殺記念館に行かれるべきです。
その膨大な犠牲者のためにですね、やっぱりそういう裁きが、行われてですね、でそういう犯罪をですね、戦争犯罪を犯した人間は必ず責任を、問われるということがですね、東京裁判を通じてですね、アジアにおいて二度とこういう戦争犯罪がですね、行われてはならないと。だからやっぱりアジアにおいてはですね、近隣諸国とのいろんな関係をですね、やっぱり平和にですね、保っていかなければならないということはですね、非常に東京裁判を通じてはっきり認識されたと思いますね。
During his last days in Sugamo prison, Iwani Matsue felt the Nanjing massacre was an unforgivable crime. He confided to his prison chaplain, Shinsho Hanayama, before he was hanged, that the Nanking incident was a terrible disgrace.